Maple Street tailoring sat between Murphy's Hardware and Chen's Grocery, a quiet corner of small-town America where everyone knew everyone else's business. Margaret Chen hemmed dresses for proms, altered suits for funerals, and mended children's clothes with infinite patience. The whole town loved their gentle seamstress. None of them suspected she was one of the CIA's most effective assassins. Welcome to Whispers of Lives. Before we begin this incredible story of a gentle seamstress whose steady hands once eliminated targets in the world's most dangerous operations, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that some threads connect us to extraordinary pasts we never imagined, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who protect us from the shadows. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of her shop window, casting delicate shadows across bolts of fabric arranged with military precision. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and examined the wedding dress spread across her work table. Sarah Mitchell's daughter was getting married next weekend, and the dress needed 3 inches taken off the hem. Margaret's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, placing pins exactly where they needed to be. Each measurement was perfect, each stitch would be invisible. She had learned precision long before she'd learned to sew. In a training facility outside Langley, where missing by a millimeter could mean the difference between life and death. The shop bell chimed, and Detective Frank Morrison entered, holding his uniform jacket. "Morning, Margaret. Got a tear in the sleeve. Caught it on a fence during that domestic call yesterday." "Of course, Detective," Margaret said with the warm smile that had become her trademark. "Let me take a look." She examined the tear with professional eyes. 12 inches long, fabric stressed, but not shredded, easily reparable. But her training made her note other details. Gunpowder residue barely visible on the cuff. Defensive wounds healing on Morrison's knuckles, the way he favored his left shoulder. "Rough call?" she asked gently, pinning the tear. Morrison nodded grimly. "Thompson's been drinking again. Wife called it in when he started throwing furniture. Had to wrestle a chair away from him." Margaret had sewn Morrison's uniforms for 8 years. She'd also sewn tracking devices into enemy clothing, stitched poison-tipped needles into lapels, and once used silk thread to strangle an arms dealer in Prague. But Detective Morrison didn't need to know that his gentle seamstress had eliminated 17 targets across 4 continents before retiring to this peaceful town. "I'll have this ready by tomorrow afternoon," she said, hanging the jacket on a repair hook. "No charge. You do enough for this community." After Morrison left, Margaret returned to the wedding dress. Her hands moved with the same deadly precision that had once made her invaluable to the agency. But now that precision served love instead of death. She thought about Sarah Mitchell's daughter, bright-eyed Emma, who worked weekends at the library and dreamed of becoming a teacher. The town of Millbrook had given Margaret something she'd never expected to find: peace. For 12 years, she'd lived in shadows, her existence erased from official records, her identity shifting like silk in the wind. Margaret Chen wasn't even her real name. That woman had died in a car bombing in Istanbul, at least according to the classified files. But here, threading a needle by the window, she was simply the seamstress who remembered everyone's measurements, who never charged veterans for repairs, and who somehow always had exactly the right fabric for whatever project walked through her door. The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Patterson entered with her grandson's torn baseball uniform. 8-year-old Tyler had slid into home plate with more enthusiasm than skill, leaving a 4-inch tear in the knee. "Can you fix this, Margaret? The season's almost over, and it's his lucky uniform." "Of course," Margaret smiled, examining the damage. "Tyler's having a good season, I hear." "Best hitter on the team," Mrs. Patterson beamed, "though he needs to work on his sliding technique." As Margaret pinned the tear, she calculated the stress points in the fabric, the best thread tension for durability, the invisible mending technique that would make the repair stronger than the original. These same analytical skills had once helped her plan infiltration routes through hostile territory and identify the precise weakness in an enemy's defenses. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers. Mayor Bradley needed his suit let out. Too many campaign dinners. Lisa Rodriguez brought her daughter's quinceañera dress for final adjustments. Old Mr. Chun from the grocery store next door stopped by with a shirt that had lost 3 buttons. Each interaction was pleasant, familiar, safe. Margaret had cultivated this persona carefully. The helpful immigrant who'd learned English and built a small business through hard work and dedication. Everyone assumed she was Chinese, and she let them. In reality, Margaret Chen had been born Maria Santos in Mexico City, recruited by the CIA at 19, and transformed into whoever the mission required. As evening approached, Margaret was putting the finishing touches on Emma Mitchell's wedding dress when she heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots, deliberate gait, 2 men approaching the shop. Her fingers stilled on the silk fabric. The shop had closed at 6, but the lights were still on. Through the lace curtains, she could see 2 figures examining her door, testing the handle. Her hearing, trained to detect the smallest sounds that might mean danger, picked up whispered conversation. Look for the safe. She's got to keep the day's cash somewhere. Make it quick. Cops patrol this street every hour. Margaret set down her needle and moved to the light switch, plunging the shop into darkness. In the blackness, she shed the gentle seamstress persona, like taking off a coat. Her posture changed, her breathing slowed, and her awareness expanded to encompass every detail of her environment. The lock clicked. They'd picked it in under 30 seconds. Professional thieves, not desperate amateurs. The door opened slowly, and 2 men entered, flashlight beams sweeping across her organized workspace. Check behind the counter, one whispered. These old-school shops always keep a lockbox. Margaret remained motionless in the shadows beside her fabric cabinet, evaluating her options. The first man was approximately 6 feet tall, muscular build, moving with confidence. The second was shorter but broader, and she could see the outline of a weapon tucked into his waistband. In her CIA days, this situation would have been resolved in seconds with lethal force. But Margaret Chen, the seamstress, couldn't simply eliminate 2 burglars in her shop. She needed a more subtle approach. She picked up one of her sewing needles, not the antique one she used for delicate work, but a heavy-duty upholstery needle, titanium steel, perfectly balanced. Her fingers found 2 spools of strong thread, the kind used for repairing heavy canvas. The first burglar moved behind her counter, searching for a safe that didn't exist. Margaret kept her cash in the bank deposit slot outside, never more than $40 in the shop overnight. But they didn't know that. As he bent down to check underneath the register, Margaret moved. 12 years of intensive training had taught her to move without sound, to strike without warning, to control without killing. She stepped behind him and placed the needle point against the base of his skull, exactly where the spinal column met the brain stem. "Don't move," she whispered in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Don't speak. Don't even breathe loudly." The man froze instantly. He'd felt that needle point and understood that whoever held it knew exactly what they were doing. "Your friend," Margaret continued quietly, "is going to turn around very slowly and place his weapon on the floor." The second burglar spun around, his hand moving toward his gun. He stopped when he saw his partner's situation, a small, middle-aged Asian woman in a floral dress, holding what looked like a sewing needle to his friend's neck, but somehow conveying more menace than if she'd held a gun. "Lady, you don't want to do this," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Actually," Margaret replied calmly, "I'm probably the only person in this town who's perfectly qualified to do this. Gun on the floor. Now." Something in her tone convinced him. The weapon clattered to the wooden planks. "Excellent. Now, both of you are going to sit down at my work table and put your hands flat on the surface." As they complied, Margaret used her thread to quickly and expertly bind their wrists to her heavy oak table. The knots were complex, tightening with any struggle, but not cutting off circulation, techniques she'd learned for restraining prisoners during interrogation. "This is crazy," the first burglar muttered. "You're just a seamstress." Margaret smiled as she checked his bonds. "I am a seamstress. I alter clothing, repair tears, and help people look their best for important occasions. But I'm also someone who values the peace and safety of this community. She moved to her phone and dialed 911. Hello, this is Margaret Chen at Maple Street Tailoring. I have 2 burglars here who need to be picked up. Yes, they're secure. No, I'm fine. Thank you. While they waited for the police, Margaret returned to Emma's wedding dress, calmly continuing her work as if nothing had happened. The burglars watched in amazement as she stitched with perfect precision, humming softly to herself. How did you? The second man started to ask. Learn to tie knots like that? YouTube, Margaret said without looking up. You can learn anything online these days. Detective Morrison arrived first, followed by 2 patrol officers. He took in the scene, 2 burglars expertly restrained to a work table, and Margaret calmly sewing by lamplight. Margaret, are you all right? What happened here? They broke in looking for money, she explained simply. I managed to detain them until you arrived. Morrison examined the restraints with professional interest. These are very thorough. Where did you learn to tie knots like this? Margaret smiled her gentle smile. You pick things up over the years, detective. Would you like some tea while you process the scene? As the officers led the burglars away, the first one turned back to look at Margaret with something like respect in his eyes. Lady, you're not what you seem. None of us are, she replied softly. After the police left, Margaret finished the wedding dress and locked up her shop. Walking home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, she reflected on how her life had changed. Once, she had been a ghost, moving through a world of violence and deception. Now she was a cornerstone of this small community, someone people trusted with their most precious garments and their casual conversations. The skills remained the awareness, the precision, the ability to read people and situations. But she used them now to serve rather than to kill, to mend rather than to destroy. At home in her small apartment above the bakery, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat by her window overlooking Main Street. Tomorrow, Emma Mitchell would have her perfect wedding dress, Detective Morrison would have his uniform repaired, and the town would have one more story about their remarkable seamstress. Some threads, she thought, connect us to our past. Others weave us into a future we never expected. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get to choose which threads to follow and which to cut away forever. Margaret Chen, former CIA operative, current guardian of Millbrook's seams and secrets, finished her tea and prepared for another peaceful night's sleep in the small town that had given her something she'd never thought possible. A chance to use her deadly skills to protect rather than to destroy, to serve with her hands rather than to eliminate with them. The needle may have been her weapon, but kindness had become her strength.